Apache woman's leg was bitten by a snake. Cowboy saved her life by sucking out the poison. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The late afternoon sun pressed hard against the land, flattening everything in its path. The desert of 1881 was no place for hesitation. Thorne Maddox knew that well. He had been riding since morning, heading back to his cabin after a supply run into the near settlement. The trip had been routine: flour, beans, cartridges, coffee, a few strips of tobacco. Nothing out of the ordinary. The ride home was long, hours across dry rock and shallow creek beds, and he didn't like to be caught outside after dark. He had spent too many years walking alone under hostile skies. Thorne was 39 years old, broad in the shoulders and still strong, though the years of dust and silence weighed on him heavier than most. His dark hair was streaked with gray, his jaw rough with an unshaven beard, and his eyes were set in the shape of a man who didn't forgive himself easily. Once he had served as a hired hand in border disputes, leading men through rough jobs. But one job had gone wrong, bad decisions made under his watch, and men who trusted him had ended up in the ground. He carried that guilt like a permanent weight, and it had pushed him out here to a cabin far removed from towns, people, and questions. His mission now was simple: stay alive, keep his land, and avoid the mistakes of the past. He followed the stream because it cut hours off his return and because water, thin as it ran this time of year, always meant his horse could last longer. That was when he spotted her. At first, she looked like a bundle of rags dropped on the sand, lying awkwardly near the bend of the creek. His gut told him to keep riding. Trouble always wore strange shapes out here. It was better not to get tangled in other people's misery. He pulled the reins anyway, his horse slowing, his jaw tightening as he weighed the choice. He dismounted, boots grinding in the gravel. He approached slow, his hand brushing over the worn handle of his revolver out of habit. When he knelt down, he realized it wasn't a bundle at all. It was a woman. Her skin was bronze, her black hair tangled with dust, strips of leather and feathers still clinging to the braids. She was young, no more than 24 by his guess, though the desert and her condition made her look older in that moment. Her dress of deerskin was torn, beads broken loose, fringe caked with dirt. The neckline had been pulled low, exposing more of her chest than she probably intended, and the skirt was ripped along the thigh. His eyes dropped to her leg. That was where the danger showed itself. The flesh around her ankle was swollen and purple, 2 puncture marks glaring out of the skin. He had seen enough bites to know what it was. Rattlesnake. If the poison had spread too far, she wouldn't make it. He felt the tension rise in his chest, that pressure that came whenever he had to make a choice he couldn't undo. She stirred when his shadow fell across her face, her eyes snapping open. They were sharp and dark, filled with fever but still burning with mistrust. She tried to move, a weak shove against his arm, but it was useless. He could see the fear in her, the instinct to resist him because he was a white man, because men like him had taken too much from people like her. He felt the old conflict in himself. He didn't want to be another burden on someone already broken, but he also couldn't leave her. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. He pulled his knife from his belt. Her eyes widened, her hand shooting up to push him away, but he caught her wrist. His voice came out low, steady, though his heart was pounding harder than he wanted to admit. Hold still. You'll die if I don't. He made the cut above the bite, fast and clean. She cried out, her body jerking, her fingers clawing at his shoulder. He pushed her back gently but firmly, lowering his mouth to the wound. The taste was bitter, metallic, and foul. He spat it into the dirt, drew again, spat again. Her chest heaved with each pull, her torn dress shifting with emotion, her breath ragged. He forced himself to focus on the wound, on keeping her alive, and not on the heat of her skin or the closeness of her body. The longer he worked, the more his jaw tightened. He had saved lives before, and he had lost them too. Every time it came down to a choice, keep going or stop. He kept going until he was sure most of the venom was out. He sat back finally, spitting one last time, wiping his mouth on the back of his sleeve. His throat was raw, and his hands were steady only because he willed them to be. "You'll live," he said, voice low. She didn't believe him. Not yet. Her eyes were narrowed, still sharp even through the fever. Her lips parted, but no words came. He reached for his canteen and tipped it to her mouth. She drank slow, a trickle down her chin. Her body sagged as the little strength she had gave way. Thorn weighed the choice again. He could leave her. He could ride on and let the desert do the rest. No one would know, but the thought wouldn't sit. Not after what he had already done. He had cut into her flesh, tasted the poison, promised in his own way that she would live. If he left now, he would only add her ghost to the others that already followed him. He slid his arms under her and lifted. She was light, but she burned with fever heat, her head falling against his chest. The torn fabric of her dress brushed his arm, warm skin pressing through. He carried her to the horse, grunting as he set her on the saddle, then mounted up behind her. His arms circled her waist to hold her steady, her body leaning against him. She didn't resist this time. Her head rested under his chin, her breath uneven, each exhale hot against his shirt. He kept the horse steady, one hand tight on the reins, the other locked around her to keep her from slipping. The desert stretched out before them, wide and silent. He glanced at the sky, the sun already beginning to drop. His cabin was still miles away, hours at this pace. The fever would hit her harder before night. He could already feel her weight sinking heavier against him. Thorn breathed slow, trying to push back the unease rising in him. He didn't want this responsibility. He had buried too much already. But the decision was made the moment he put his mouth to her wound. As the horse carried them into the lengthening shadows, he muttered to himself, barely louder than the creak of leather and the rhythm of hooves. "You're not dying out here. Not like this." The words were rough, but they bound him to her in a way he couldn't undo. The ride back to Thorn's cabin stretched long into the evening, the sky turning from gold to deepening blue while the horse carried the weight of both of them. The woman leaned heavier against him with every mile, her breath shallow, her skin hot. He felt each tremor that ran through her body. She was fevered now, and the poison would either take her or burn itself out. He kept his arm locked around her waist, his other hand steady on the reins, pushing his horse harder than he normally would. He couldn't risk stopping, not out here in open land where the night carried cold and the rattlers came out again. By the time the first stars appeared, the outline of his cabin came into view, a low, single-room structure built against the slope of the canyon wall. The roof was rough, patched from the last storm, and the corral nearby stood half empty. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. As he reined in the horse, he felt her slump harder against him, her head dropping against his chest like she had nothing left. He dismounted quick, catching her before she slid. Carrying her inside, he kicked the door shut with his boot. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dust. A rifle leaned against the wall near the door. Shelves lined with jars of beans, flour, coffee, and dried meat filled one corner. His cot sat against the far wall, covered in a wool blanket. He lowered her onto it, careful with her leg. She stirred, eyes half open, whispering something he couldn't catch in Apache. He crouched, studying her face, sweat on her brow, lips cracked, breath shallow. "Don't talk," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. "Save your strength." He dug through his supplies, pulling out a rag, a small basin, and a flask of whiskey he kept for disinfecting. He cut the fabric of her dress further at the leg to expose the wound. Her skin was flushed, her thigh tense under his hand as he worked. He poured whiskey over the cut. She gasped, her hand jerking to push him away, but she was too weak. He pressed the rag down to clean the blood and dirt, his jaw tightening at the heat radiating off her. He wrapped the wound with a strip of clean cloth, tying it firm. His hands moved steady, but inside his chest his thoughts twisted. She was Apache. He knew enough of the territory to understand the risks. If her people came looking, finding her here in his bed, it would mean trouble. If the townsfolk found out he was keeping an Indian woman under his roof, it would be worse. But leaving her had not been an option, and now she was here, her life resting in his hands. She shifted weakly, her head turning toward him. Her eyes opened just enough to meet his. For a moment he saw not anger, not fear, but confusion, like she was trying to measure what kind of man he was. He looked away first, pulling the blanket over her. He built the fire higher, filled the basin with cool water, and pressed the rag to her forehead. She murmured again in Apache. He shook his head. "I don't know your words," he said quietly. Still, he stayed there, cooling her skin, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Hours passed slow. Her fever climbed, then broke into shivers. He fed her small sips of water, holding the canteen steady at her lips. Once, her hand caught his wrist, gripping it with surprising strength. He looked at her, and she whispered in broken English, "Why help?" The question cut deep. He thought of the men he'd failed before, the ones buried because he hadn't acted fast enough. He swallowed hard, his voice low, "Because I didn't want another ghost." She seemed to hear him, though her eyes closed again soon after. Through the long night, he stayed close, dozing in the chair by the bed, but never fully asleep. Each time she stirred, he checked her wound, re-wet the cloth, offered water. He had lived alone for years, and now there was someone breathing in his cabin besides himself, someone depending on him not to falter. It stirred something in him he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Responsibility and something sharper he didn't name. By dawn, the fever had eased. Her breathing steadied, her body less restless. He sat back, rubbing his tired eyes. The sun lit the edges of the cabin wall, and he realized the choice he made yesterday had already changed the course of his life. Whether she stayed or left, whether her people came or not, nothing would go back to the quiet emptiness he had known. When she woke properly, she would have questions. So would he, who had left her alone by the creek. How long had she been wandering? Why had she been dressed in torn clothing, half stripped of dignity? These were the things he knew he couldn't avoid. But for now, she was alive. That was enough. He leaned back in the chair, revolver resting on his thigh out of habit, eyes on the woman stretched on his bed. She looked small despite her curves, fragile despite the sharpness in her stare the night before. He told himself he would keep it simple. Heal her, feed her, send her on her way. But deep down, in the space he never spoke of, he already knew it wouldn't be that simple. The morning light crept slowly into the cabin, slipping through the cracks of the shutters and cutting across the floorboards. Thorn Maddox was already awake, though he hadn't slept more than a handful of minutes through the night. He sat in the chair near the cot, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the woman he had carried in from the desert. She had stopped shivering sometime before dawn. Her breathing had steadied, and the flush of fever no longer burned as fiercely against her skin. He had seen too many men taken by poison to believe in easy survival, so every small change made him watchful, cautious. When her eyes opened, it happened slow, like she was fighting to lift a weight heavier than her own body. She blinked, confused at the sight of the wooden ceiling, the walls stacked with shelves, and then her gaze found him. He didn't move at first, letting her take in where she was. He could see the tension return to her shoulders, the distrust settling back into her eyes, even though her body was too weak to fight. "You're awake," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying no welcome but no threat either. Her lips parted, cracked from dryness, and for a moment no sound came. Then, softly, halting in broken English, she asked, "Where here?" "My place," he answered. "Cabin's mine. You were dying out by the creek. Snake got you. I brought you in." Her eyes moved to her leg. She shifted slightly and winced at the pain in her calf where he had cut and wrapped it. The cloth was already dark with dried blood and whiskey. She ran her fingers weakly over it, then looked back at him. "You cut me," she whispered. Not a question, but an accusation. "Had to," he said plainly. "Poison would have spread otherwise. You'd be dead." She stared at him, as though weighing his words against her own sense of survival. He could see her trying to decide whether to trust him, and he didn't press her for more. He stood, poured water into a tin cup, and held it out. "Drink. Slow." She hesitated before taking it, her hand brushing his. Her touch was hot, not from fever now, but from the heat that seemed to radiate from her whole body. She sipped carefully, eyes never leaving his face. He could see the questions forming, the doubts that anyone in her place would have. Why'd he helped? Why hadn't he left her like so many others might? He gave her the truth before she could ask again. I didn't want to ride on and let you die out there. Already got enough ghosts on my back. She frowned slightly at the words, not fully understanding, but the weight in his tone told her there was history behind it. She leaned back against the pillow he had stuffed under her head, breathing slower now, her body not as tense. Thorne stepped back, giving her space. He moved to the shelf, pulled down a tin of beans, and set them near the fire. He needed to feed her something when she was ready, and it gave him a task to keep his hands busy. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger. Name? Thorne Maddox, he said, glancing back at her. Most just call me Thorne. And you? She paused, her lips pressing together, as if giving her name cost her something. Ahiona, she said finally. The sound of it filled the room, soft but firm. He nodded once. Ahiona. He repeated it carefully, giving respect to the syllables, making sure she knew he had heard her right. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He studied her face in the light, the curve of her cheek, the sharp line of her jaw, the way her eyes shifted between suspicion and something softer. Her dress was still torn low at the neckline, the rip along her thigh revealing more than modesty allowed. He pulled a blanket from the trunk and set it gently across her without a word. She looked at him sharply for the gesture, but she didn't throw it off. It was then he realized what listeners might have wondered the night before. Why she had been alone in the desert, why her dress was torn, why no one had come for her. He asked the question slow, careful. You got people nearby? Family. Her eyes lowered. Her hand clenched the blanket. She hesitated, then shook her head once. No, not anymore. The way she said it, heavy and clipped, told him not to push. Still, it filled in the silence from before. She hadn't just been lost. She had been left or driven away. You were running, he said, not as a question. She met his eyes then, sharp and unflinching. Yes. He didn't ask from who. Not yet. He knew the look of someone carrying more than they would share with a stranger. He had worn the same look himself for years. Then rest, he said simply. Your leg won't carry you anywhere for a while. Best you get your strength back. Her mouth pressed into a tight line, but she gave the smallest nod. She understood her life hung in his hands now, and though she didn't like it, she had no choice but to accept it. Thorne turned back to the fire, stirring the beans. His thoughts churned, not with words but with the weight of the new reality. He had lived alone for years because he thought it was safer for himself, for anyone else who crossed his path. But now there was an Apache woman in his bed, alive because he had refused to walk away. The moment he carried her into the cabin, he had made himself responsible. And responsibility had a way of changing a man, whether he wanted it to or not. When he glanced back, she was already watching him. Her eyes didn't waver, and he felt the same tension he had felt the moment he bent down in the dirt by the creek. The sense that whatever passed between them from here on, neither of their lives would return to what they were before. The day passed slow, the sun climbing and falling in the sky, while the desert heat pressed against the cabin walls. Thorne spent much of the morning working outside, repairing a broken rail on the corral and hauling water from the creek, though his mind never left the woman lying inside. He checked on her often, his boots heavy across the wooden floorboards as he stepped back in to find her either asleep or watching him with guarded eyes. Each time, he offered water, sometimes bread softened in broth, and each time she accepted without a word more than necessary. By midday, she tried to push herself upright against the cot. He saw her struggle, the blanket slipping, her dark hair falling across her face. Her leg trembled with the effort, her hand clenching the bed frame until her knuckles whitened. He set down the bucket he was carrying and crossed the room. Don't, he said sharply, though not unkindly. You'll tear the wound open again. Her eyes flicked to him with defiance, a glimmer of pride burning through the weakness of her body. I'm not child, she managed in broken English, her voice low but firm. I didn't say you were, he answered, standing over her, his voice even. But you're not ready. For a long moment, they stared at each other, her breath uneven, his jaw tight. Then she let herself sink back down, pulling the blanket higher. He turned away, but he could feel her gaze on his back, sharp and heavy. Later, when the heat began to ease, she called out softly, "Why?" He looked up from the table where he had been mending tack. "Why what?" Her eyes searched his, her hand clutching the blanket near her chest. "Why help me? You don't know me. My people, your people, not the same." Thorne set the leather aside, leaned back in the chair, and studied her. He had known the question would come. Anyone listening to the tale would ask it too. Why a man like him, who lived alone and avoided ties, would risk himself for a woman who had every reason not to trust him? "I told you before," he said slowly. "I've already got enough ghosts. I don't want another one." Her brow furrowed, as if she didn't fully understand, but she nodded once, accepting that answer for now. To fill the silence that followed, he asked a question of his own, one listeners would demand to know. "How long were you out there before I found you?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together, but then she spoke. 2 days, maybe 3. No food, no water, just walking." "Why alone?" he pressed gently. Her jaw tightened. "Exiled." The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Thorne waited, but she didn't add more. He saw the pain in her eyes, the shame beneath it, and he didn't force her to explain. She would if and when she wanted to. For now, the word was enough to answer the silence left back at the creek. Evening settled in, and Thorne lit the lantern. He noticed her eyes following his every move, the way he reached for the revolver each time he stepped outside, the way he checked the door latch twice before sitting down, the way his shoulders stayed tense even when he was still. He had lived so long alone that he didn't think of these habits anymore. But now with her there, he realized they told her as much about him as words ever could. "You don't trust easy," she said suddenly, her English more clear this time, though still halting. "Neither do you," he answered, meeting her gaze. She gave the smallest smile, faint and weary, but it was the first sign of something softer between them. Before she drifted back to sleep, she asked one more question, quiet and uncertain. "You send me away when I'm well?" The question struck him harder than he expected. His instinct was to say yes, to tell her this was only temporary, that once she could walk, she would leave and he would return to silence. But the words stuck in his throat. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, adjusted the blanket over her, and muttered, "Rest." When she closed her eyes, he sat back in his chair, staring at the fire. He knew anyone watching their story unfold would demand that answer. Would he keep her? Would he let her go? He didn't know himself yet. What he did know was that the thought of her leaving brought a weight to his chest he hadn't felt in years. Through the night, as the desert winds scraped against the cabin walls, Thorne remained near, his revolver close, his eyes fixed on the woman who had turned his life from silence into something far more complicated in a single day. And though he told himself it was only about duty and survival, deep inside he already knew it wasn't. The morning after the fever broke, Thorne woke to the sound of movement inside the cabin. His instincts had him upright in the chair with his hand on the revolver before he even registered it was her. Ahiona was trying to rise from the cot, her blanket tangled around her legs, her face tight with effort. She managed to sit up, her dark hair falling over her shoulder in loose strands. But when she tried to swing her swollen leg over the side, the pain caught her. She gasped, gripping the wood frame, her body trembling with the effort not to fall. Thorne crossed the space in 2 steps. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was sharp, sharper than he intended. Her eyes cut to his, steady even through the weakness. "I can't stay in bed forever," she answered, her English broken but clear. "You can't stand yet," he said firmly, crouching beside her. "Your leg won't take it. You'll tear it open." Her jaw set. "I'm not useless." The word struck him, not because of the defiance, but because of the weight behind them. He realized then that anyone listening might have wondered why she carried such fierce pride, even in weakness, why the thought of being useless cut her so deeply. He hadn't asked her what exile meant, not really, but the answer showed itself in the way she fought even to sit upright. She had been cast out, judged, left to survive on her own. To her, proving strength was survival. "You're not useless," he said quietly, surprising himself. "You're alive. That's enough right now." She studied him for a long moment, her breathing uneven, then allowed him to guide her back against the pillow. She didn't thank him, but she didn't resist either. That was something. As the day stretched on, she grew restless. While he chopped wood outside, she pushed herself to sit again, testing her leg. He came back to find her trying to reach for the small pot of water near the fire. She froze when she saw him in the doorway, caught like a child sneaking something forbidden. "If you want something," he said, voice low, "ask." Her lips pressed into a tight line. "I don't want to be waited on," she replied. "You're not," he answered, hanging his hat on the hook by the door. "You're healing. There's a difference." That night, while the fire glowed low, she finally asked the question that had been hovering since the first day. "Why do you live alone?" Thorn didn't answer right away. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the flames. "Because I made mistakes," he said finally. "Men followed me once. I led them into the wrong fight. They didn't come back. I did. Can't carry that and pretend I belong in town with the rest." She listened, her sharp eyes softening slightly. She didn't press for more, but her silence wasn't judgment. It was the silence of someone who understood what it meant to carry shame. For the first time since he'd found her, he felt the edge of trust settle between them. The following morning, she insisted on trying to help. He had set beans to boil when she pushed herself upright again, this time with more strength. She reached for the spoon, her hand brushing his as she did. The touch lingered a second too long before she pulled back. He didn't comment, only stepped aside and let her stir. Her movements were slow, careful, but steady. "You'll undo the bandage if you keep this up," he warned. "I can sit," she replied. "I can use my hands." It was true, and as she stirred the pot, he realized how different the cabin felt with her moving about, even if only in small ways. For years, the only sound had been his boots, his chair, the fire. Now, there was her voice, her presence. Later, when he checked her wound, she stiffened as his fingers brushed her thigh to unwrap the cloth. The dress had torn higher than decent, and though he kept his eyes on the wound, he was aware of her curves, the warmth of her skin under his hand. He worked quickly, applying fresh cloth, but his breath was heavier than he wanted. She noticed. He could feel it in the way her gaze lingered on him. "You don't look," she said suddenly, her voice low. He paused, glanced up at her. "Not the way others did," she added. His jaw tightened. "I'm not like others." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning neither of them named. She studied him a moment longer, then leaned back, letting him finish without another word. By evening, she was able to sit at the table, propped on one side, her plate of beans in front of her. It wasn't much, but she ate slow and steady, her appetite returning. He watched her more than he admitted, noticing the curve of her cheek when the firelight touched it, the way her braid had loosened and strands of hair fell against her collarbone. He told himself it was simple observation, but the longer he looked, the harder it was to believe that lie. Before sleep, she asked quietly, "When I walk again, you send me away?" He froze in the act of setting another log on the fire. He knew the question was coming. Anyone listening would wonder the same. He turned to her, his face half-shadowed in the lantern light. "When you're ready," he said slowly, "that'll be your choice." Her eyes searched his, looking for falsehood, but he gave none. She nodded once, satisfied. That night, as the fire dimmed, Thorn lay back in the chair and closed his eyes. The sound of her breathing filled the cabin. He told himself she was only passing through, that this was temporary. But deep in his chest, he already knew the truth. His silence was no longer his alone, and he didn't want it to be. The next 2 days brought slow change inside the cabin. The swelling in Ahiona's leg began to ease under Thorn's steady care, though the wound was still tender, wrapped in fresh strips of cloth he boiled and cleaned each morning. She could sit up without shaking now, and by leaning on the table or the wall, she managed a few careful steps. Thorn kept a watchful eye, his hand never far from her elbow when she tried to move. Each time she stumbled, pride and stubbornness flashed in her eyes, but he steadied her anyway, never commenting, never mocking. The cabin itself had shifted with her presence. For years it had been quiet, its corners filled only with his boots, his coat, his rifle, and the small supply of food he rationed out for himself. Now, there were signs of her everywhere. Her blanket folded near the fire, a braid of her dark hair left draped across her shoulder when she slept, the faint sound of her humming under her breath as she stirred a pot he had set for her. These small things turned the silence into something different, no longer empty, but filled with a weight he wasn't used to carrying. That morning, she insisted on helping with chores. He had stepped outside to split wood, only to return and find her crouched awkwardly at the fire, grinding dried corn with a mortar and pestle. Her torn deerskin dress slipped low as she worked, her curves shifting with each press of her hand, and though she winced each time her injured leg took weight, her jaw was set in determination. "You shouldn't be doing that," Thorne said, his tone sharp. "I can't," she replied quickly, her English improving each day. "If I stay in bed, I die inside. I work, I live." He stood in the doorway, watching her. Her words carried a truth he couldn't argue. She wasn't just trying to help. She was trying to claim dignity after being left to die alone in the desert. Anyone listening would have wondered about her pride, about why she refused rest. And here was the answer. Exile had taken her people from her, but she refused to let it take her worth. "Fine," he said finally, his voice softer. "But don't push too far." She gave the smallest smile, rare and fleeting, but it stayed with him. That evening, while he checked her bandage again, she studied him closely. His hands were rough, his movement steady, but she noticed the way he avoided looking directly at her exposed thigh. He focused only on the wound, though the closeness between them hung heavy. She broke the silence with a question that had lingered since the beginning. "Your people, they come here?" "Friends." He shook his head. "No friends. No one comes out here unless they're lost, or they're looking for trouble." "You choose that," she pressed. "I did," he answered. "After the job that went wrong, after the men who didn't come back, I figure it was better not to bring harm to anyone else." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face. "So you hide." The word struck harder than he expected. He felt heat rise in his chest, but he didn't deny it. "Maybe I do," he admitted. She didn't look away. "And now?" He tied off the fresh cloth, his jaw tight. "Now, I'm not hiding from you." Their eyes held for a moment, longer than either meant to allow. She breathed out slow, then leaned back, pulling the blanket higher. Neither spoke again, but the weight of that exchange stayed. The following day, tension from the outside world returned. As the sun dropped low, Thorne went out to the corral to bring in the horse. From the ridge beyond, he caught movement. 3 riders passing slowly, their outlines dark against the fading sky. They didn't turn down toward the cabin, but they slowed enough to study the smoke rising from his chimney. His jaw tightened. In these lands, riders could mean ranch hands, drifters, or worse, men looking for what wasn't theirs. He kept his hand on his revolver until they disappeared into the distance. When he returned, Ahiona saw the change in his face. "Men?" she asked. He nodded. "Just passing for now." She lowered her eyes, her hand clenching the blanket. "If they know I am here, they come. Then they'll answer to me," he said flatly. She looked at him then, testing the truth of his words. He stood firm, his revolver hanging heavy at his side, his body blocking the door, as if by instinct. For the first time since she had woken in his cabin, she seemed to believe him. That night, as the fire burned low, she whispered a final question that many listening would have wondered since the start. "If I was not Apache, would you still help?" He met her eyes across the firelight. "I didn't think about that when I saw you. Just saw someone about to die. That was enough." She turned her face away, but he caught the small tremor of relief in her shoulders. It was the beginning of something fragile, but something real. As she drifted to sleep, Thorne sat in the chair, his revolver on his thigh, his eyes never leaving the door. The desert outside held its dangers, but for the first time in years, he wasn't watching only for himself. He was watching for her. The morning broke clear and cold, the kind of desert air that carried a bite even with the sun rising over the ridges. Thorne stood outside the cabin, a tin cup of coffee warming his hands, his eyes set on the horizon. He hadn't forgotten the riders he'd seen the evening before, and anyone paying attention would be asking the same question he asked himself now. Who were they? And would they be back? He knew the answer was most likely yes. Smoke from a chimney in the middle of nowhere always drew notice. Inside, he heard Ahiona stirring. She had gained strength each day, though her legs still bound her to slow steps and short efforts. He stepped back in, the door creaking on its hinges, and found her sitting upright on the cot, her blanket drawn close around her shoulders. She looked at him the way she always did first thing in the morning, sharp, guarded, as if weighing whether he was the same man she had trusted the night before. "You watch again," she said, nodding toward the rifle near the door. "Always," Thorne answered, setting the cup down. "Men come back. They might." His voice was steady, but inside his gut tightened with the truth of it. He had lived long enough to know that strangers didn't pass by without reason. She studied him, then asked the question that had hung unspoken since the night he carried her here. "If they come, and they want me," he didn't hesitate, "they'll have to go through me." She held his gaze, searching for weakness, but found none. Something softened in her face, just for a breath, before she looked down again. The day stretched with chores. Thorne chopped wood, repaired a fence post broken by the last windstorm, and checked the creek for fresh tracks. Ahiona insisted on helping again, moving slower but steadier now. She managed to grind corn without spilling half, her hands sure even as her leg protested. At one point, she tried to carry a bucket of water from the door to the table. He stepped in quickly, steadying her when she nearly toppled, his arms slipping around her waist. Her body pressed against his for an instant, warm and firm despite her weakness. She froze, eyes darting to his, and he let go at once, stepping back as if the touch had burned him. "You're not ready for that yet," he muttered. "I will be," she said, a spark of pride flashing. That evening, while they ate together at the table, Ahiona broke the silence that had settled between them. "You ask nothing of me," she said quietly. Thorne looked up from his plate. "What do you mean?" "Other men, they would want payment. For food, for shelter, for saving life." Her eyes fixed on him, testing. He set the spoon down, his jaw tightening. "I'm not other men." The words came out flat, final. He meant them. He saw her shoulders ease the smallest bit, though her eyes still watched him, wary. That question had lingered since the beginning, and he knew listeners would have wondered too. Why had he taken her in? What did he expect in return? Now it had been said aloud, and his answer left no doubt. Later, as the fire burned low, the cabin filled with the kind of silence that wasn't empty but weighted with things unsaid. She sat on the cot, combing through her long black hair with her fingers, her braid loose, the feathers and leather strips tangled. He watched her from the chair, his eyes drawn against his will to the curve of her collarbone, the way her torn dress still slipped low across her chest. He forced his gaze away, staring into the fire instead, but the tension hung between them. "You keep distance," she said suddenly, not looking at him. "Better that way," he replied, his voice rough. "For who?" The question stopped him cold. He didn't answer, couldn't because he didn't know. He told himself it was safer. That closeness only brought loss. But every day with her in his cabin chipped away at that wall. The night grew late. Thorne finally stretched out his bedroll near the fire, as he had each night since bringing her in, giving her the cot. He heard her shift under the blanket. Then her voice, soft but clear. "If those men come back, they will not want you dead. They will want me." He opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling beams above. "Then they'll find out I don't give a damn what they want." For a long time, neither spoke again. The fire popped, the desert wind pressed against the walls, and the bond between them deepened, not in words but in the silence that followed. By dawn, Thorne knew two things with certainty. The riders would return, and when they did, he would stand between them and the woman on his cot. It wasn't duty anymore. It was choice. The riders came back at dusk. Thorne had known they would. Men like that didn't pass through the desert without purpose. Not when they had spotted smoke curling from a lone cabin where no one was supposed to live. He had spent the day making quiet preparations, checking his revolver twice, laying the rifle across the table within easy reach, and keeping the axe sharpened at the woodpile outside. He said little to Ahiona, though she felt the change in him, the heaviness in the way he moved, the sharper watch in his eyes each time he stepped out to look at the ridge. By the time the sun fell low and the canyon shadows stretched long, the sound of hooves carried through the still air. Ahiona stiffened on the cot, her hand gripping the blanket. "They come," she whispered. Thorn looked out the window slit. 3 riders, same as before, easing their horses slow toward the cabin, one leading the others. He could see rifles across their saddles, dust on their coats, faces sharp with the kind of hunger he'd seen too many times before. They weren't lawmen. They weren't neighbors. They were scavengers of opportunity. He turned back to Ahiona. "Stay quiet. Stay low. If they push in, you don't move unless I tell you." Her dark eyes burned into him, full of fear and defiance both. "They want me. Then they'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice flat, leaving no room for doubt. The knock on the door wasn't polite. It was the heavy fist of a man who believed no door could stop him. Thorn opened it anyway, standing solid in the frame, his revolver at his hip, his body filling the gap. "Evenin'," the lead rider drawled, his eyes flicking past Thorn into the cabin. "We saw your smoke the other day. Didn't reckon anyone lived out here." "I live here," Thorn answered evenly. "Ain't looking for company." The man smiled, thin and sharp. "Thing is, we heard tell there's been an Apache woman running loose in these parts. Word is she's worth a good price. Traders in Arroyo Ford pay real well for a body like that. Don't suppose you've seen her?" Thorn's jaw tightened. He didn't glance back, didn't give them the satisfaction of confirming what they already suspected. "Ain't seen anyone. Just me and my horse." The second rider leaned in his saddle, spit into the dirt. "Funny. Looked like 2 sets of tracks by the creek the other day." Thorn felt the weight of Ahiona's stare on his back. He didn't shift, didn't falter. "You're mistaken." Silence stretched. Then the lead rider's smile slipped. "Mind if we take a look inside? Just to be sure." Thorn's hand rested on the doorframe, steady. "I mind." The air tightened. The men shifted, their hands brushing the rifles strapped to their saddles. Inside, Ahiona's breath caught. Anyone listening would wonder the same thing she whispered now. "You'll fight them?" "For me." Thorn didn't turn, didn't show her his face, but his voice came low, rough. "Already decided." The first man narrowed his eyes. "Suit yourself, cowboy. But if she's in there, you're sitting on a fortune you don't deserve. We'll be back. And if we catch her outside, she's ours." They pulled their horses around, slow and deliberate, letting the threat hang in the air before riding off into the shadows. Thorn stood there until the sound of hooves faded, then shut the door and bolted it. His shoulders stayed tense even as the silence returned. Ahiona rose shakily from the cot, leaning against the table for balance. Her face was pale, her breath fast. "They will come back," she said. "Yes," Thorn answered. He began checking the rifle, his movements calm, methodical. "You could give me to them," she said, her voice low, heavy with the weight of truth. "No one would know. You would be safe." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "I'd know." Her eyes searched his, her hands trembling against the table's edge. "Why? Why risk this for me?" He let out a long breath, his voice rough. "Because I won't stand by and watch someone left behind again. Not when I can do something about it." Her lips parted, but no words came. She lowered her gaze, gripping the table as if to steady more than just her body. That night, Thorn didn't sleep. He sat in the chair, rifle across his lap, revolver close, the fire low but burning. Ahiona lay awake too, her breathing steady but restless. She watched him in the dim light, the shape of his shoulders broad and unyielding. In that silence, she saw the answer to the question that had haunted her since he found her by the creek. Would he protect her because he wanted something in return, or because he chose to? Tonight had shown her the truth. When her eyes finally closed, it was the first time since exile that she slept without fear of being dragged away in the night. Thorn sat motionless, eyes on the door, every muscle taut. He knew the riders would be back, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But when they came, he would be ready. And for the first time in years, he wasn't preparing to defend himself alone. He was preparing to defend her. The riders came back at dawn, just as Thorn had expected. The first sound was the crunch of hooves on gravel, faint but steady, rolling down from the ridge. He was already awake, seated at the table with his rifle across his lap, eyes sharp and set. Ahiona stirred on the cot, her body tensing before her eyes even opened. She knew before he spoke. They're here. Her hand clutched the blanket, her voice tight. They won't leave without me this time. They won't take you, Thorn said, his tone even, carrying the weight of a man who had decided long before this moment. He rose and stepped to the door, pushing it open just enough to see them. 3 riders again, but this time they were spread wide, making no effort to hide their intent. Rifles were slung across their backs, pistols on their hips. They stopped within 20 paces of the cabin. The leader grinned, though his eyes carried no humor. "Morning," the man called. "We gave you time to think it over. Last chance, Cowboy. Hand her out, and we'll ride on. No blood spilt. Hell, you might even get a cut of the pay she'll fetch." Thorn stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, shoulders broad and unflinching. His hat cast his eyes in shadow, but his voice carried clear. "She's not yours to take. Not now, not ever." The leader's grin faded. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure." A silence followed, the kind that pressed heavy on the air. The second rider spat in the dirt. The third shifted in his saddle, uneasy but hungry for violence. Then the leader nodded, and the standoff broke. The first shot cracked loud in the open desert. Thorn was already moving, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. The second rider fell from his horse, the impact kicking up a cloud of dust. The others spurred forward, guns drawn. Thorn dropped to cover by the corner of the cabin, firing steady and deliberate, each shot placed with the control of a man who had lived too long with weapons in his hands. Inside, Ahiona clutched the wall, her body trembling. She wanted to run to him, to help, but her legs still burned with pain. Instead, she grabbed the spare revolver he had left on the table, her fingers closing around the grip. She crouched low near the window slit, watching with sharp eyes. The third rider circled wide, trying to flank the cabin. Thorn caught the movement too late, until a gunshot rang from inside. Ahiona's hand was steady as she fired through the gap, the bullet striking the man in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. He dropped into the dirt with a scream. Thorn glanced back, just once, meeting her eyes through the open window. There was no time for words, but in that moment he understood. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't just someone to be protected. She was standing with him. The leader fired again, the bullet tearing into the wood near Thorn's head. Thorn shifted, calm under the fire, and lined his shot. The man fell from his horse, the revolver slipping from his grasp before he hit the ground. Silence followed, broken only by the wheeze of wounded men and the restless snort of horses. Thorn lowered his rifle, but didn't relax. He moved across the dirt, kicking weapons from reach. 2 of the men were dead. The third clutched his arm, blood soaking his sleeve, eyes wide with fear now that his bravado had run out. "You tell anyone what you saw here," Thorn said, his voice like stone, "and you won't walk away next time. Now go." The man stumbled to his feet, climbed awkwardly into his saddle, and rode off, leaving his dead behind. Thorn stood there until the rider disappeared over the ridge, then turned back toward the cabin. Ahiona was at the doorway, leaning against the frame, the revolver still in her hand. Her braid had come loose, her dress still torn, but her eyes were steady, fierce. She looked at him, breathing hard. "You would have fought them all. I told you," Thorn said quietly. "They weren't taking you." Her eyes softened, the strength in them giving way to something else. She stepped closer, the revolver slipping from her grasp, falling into the dirt. For the first time since he had found her in the creek bed, she let herself lean into him. His arms closed around her, holding her tight, his rough jaw against her hair. "Then I stay," she whispered. "No more running. No more exile. I stay." The words struck him deeper than any bullet could. He had lived years in silence, punishing himself with solitude, believing he had nothing left to give or deserve. Now here she was choosing him, not because she had no other choice, but because she wanted to. Inside, he tended her wound again, his hand steady as he unwrapped and rewrapped the bandage. She watched him closely, her eyes no longer guarded. When he finished, his hand lingered against her thigh, not out of duty, but out of choice. She placed her hand over his, and neither moved for a long moment. That night, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just his shelter anymore. It was theirs. The ghosts of his past still lingered, but they no longer ruled him. She had her own scars, her own exile, but together they had carved something new out of the silence. As a fire burned low, she lay on the cot while he settled nearby. Her voice broke the quiet. "You don't want me to leave." He met her gaze, his answer simple and final. "No, I want you here." She smiled faintly, her eyes closing in peace she hadn't known in years. "Then I am." For the first time in a long time, Thorne Maddox felt the weight in his chest ease. No more ghosts. No more silence without meaning. In the harsh desert of 1881, he and Ahiona had found what neither had believed they could have again: a home and someone to share it with.